Hi, you're watching Meet the Professors. We're on location at the UC Irvine School of Law. I'm Deana Pollard Sacks. I'm here with Fred Galves to discuss my forthcoming book, Sex Torts. So, Fred, what do you think about the concept of sex torts?
Well, before we even start talking about the sex part of sex torts, why don't we just talk about torts? What is tort law and why do we have tort law?
That's actually a really interesting question because we didn't always have tort law and tort liability. A tort is a civil wrong. Tort law allows people to sue other people, individuals, in court for money damages or for injunctions or other things, but mostly money damages. It grew out of the criminal law. Originally, long time ago, there was a case where the victim of the crime had a lot of problems, and the judge wanted to give her some money. So he gave her some money as part of a criminal proceeding, which is really unheard of today. But in this country, tort law is often talked about as something that grew out of the need to prevent dueling, because there was really not a good forum to go to settle interpersonal disputes. And one of the most tragic cases of dueling is the Alexander Hamilton case. I mean, one of our founding fathers, brilliant man, and he offended Aaron Burr in relation to the governor's race in New York. And of course, Aaron Burr was defeated, and he was pretty mad about it. And so he, I guess, tried to get Alexander Hamilton to recant some of what he said, and they couldn't reach an agreement, so they decided to go and do a duel. And we all know the result of that. Alexander Hamilton was shot and killed, and we lost this amazing, brilliant man in his mid-40s. So tort law is a way to prevent dueling, to prevent people from taking the law into their own hands, to go into a court of law and to settle things in a civilized manner.
And in addition to them settling it civilly, the dispute between the two of them, the tort system also, it educates the public so that the public can read about those cases and then modify their behavior. So there's an educational element. It's also to deter people. People are rational actors, and so they're going to be deterred if they know that if they engage in certain behavior where they harm someone, then they're going to be sued. That plaintiff is going to be put in the position they otherwise would have been in were it not for the wrong of the defendant.
No, absolutely. I mean, tort law has been called, a form of social engineering, of getting people to behave a certain way or not behave a certain way because of consequences that will ensue depending on how they behave. And the rational actor assumption is a basic tenet of tort law, that people will think about what might happen to them if they do a certain thing and then maybe not do it because they don't want to pay damages for it. And the funny thing a lot of people don't realize is sex has been regulated throughout history. I mean, sex has been regulated from the dawn of time. Certainly adultery and homosexuality have always been regulated.
So it's kind of like if somebody hits you in the mouth and you sue them to pay your doctor bills, that's what a tort is. But now we get into the area of sex and regulating sex and how sex might be a tort or result in a tort. So talk a little bit about the history first. You were saying about the regulation of sex overall and then in the tort system as well.
Right. Well, sex has traditionally been governed by the criminal law. Back in the 1700s, fathers could sue people who had seduced their daughters. The idea being the daughter is no longer marketable as a wife, and now the father was saddled with taking care of her for the rest of her life instead of transferring that onto the husband. And women at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, were bringing suits in their own name to recover money damages against people who seduced them, men who seduced them, promised to marry them, didn't marry them, made them unable to get married to somebody else. And those were, believe it or not, some of the most common actions in the courts of law in the early 1900s. But those laws also came under attack. Early feminists didn't like the idea that women can't figure out for themselves what they should do or shouldn't do, or that they're so easily influenced by men who are superior intellectually. And so there was an early movement to try to get rid of what they call the heart balm torts, torts to recover for damage to your heart, being sad, not being able to marry somebody else. But that movement really wasn't that successful until the 60s hit. And at that time, just so many things happened at once. I mean, we had, probably starting with the Kinsey reports, we had these ideas being disseminated throughout society that weren't even accurate, but it got people really interested in sex, talking about sex. Of course, Playboy was started as a result of the Kinsey reports, and Hugh Hefner even says that in the first edition, that we're filling a market need that was created by the Kinsey reports. About the same time, The birth control pill came out, so women now were in control of reproductive health. Government was being questioned tremendously, probably like no other time in history. So this massive cultural overhaul that also included at that time getting rid of these tort actions against, lovers, basically. So the court started throwing out all these cases saying, if someone doesn't marry you and said they would, you know what, keep it out of our court. And the thing that's really, kind of news to a lot of people is that all these things happened at once in a context in which there really wasn't much sexual disease. The only two diseases really in the 50s and 60s were gonorrhea and syphilis. And those are two bacterial infections that can be cured with an antibiotic. Well, like I said, the court started throwing out these cases, legislatures reacted, all these heart-bomb torts were being eviscerated. And I have a couple quotes as recently as 1990, 93. I just want to read what kinds of things the courts would say to plaintiffs in court who had a gripe about getting a sexual disease. And this is a case from 1990 out of Virginia. And here the court says, plaintiff's claim is clearly barred. The very illegal act to which the plaintiff consented, premarital sex we're talking about, produced the injuries and damages of which she complains. Herpes. She got herpes from that. And the foregoing principle, illegal acts, bar recovery in torts, that's a basic principle in tort law, applies even though the defendant concealed his infection from her. So he lied about having herpes, gave her herpes, and the court said, hey, it's your own fault. You shouldn't be having premarital sex. As if in 1990, most people weren't having premarital sex. Here's another one from 93, and this one comes out of New York. And here the court says, persons who engage in unprotected sex at a time of prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases, including some that are fatal, assume the risk of contracting such diseases. When one ventures out in the rain without an umbrella, should they complain when they get wet? So the courts were still sort of dismissing these cases, even though they weren't just heart-bomb torts anymore. It wasn't just seduction. It was now a matter of sexual disease.
Yeah, and then we had the explosion of the sexually transmitted diseases and infections. And so if we were to look at these trends historically, I guess to recap, the first trend would be where sex, for whatever reasons, moral reasons, religious reasons, when you were talking about it, it reminded me even of Sharia law to a certain extent, how sex was very much regulated. Then through the, as you were explaining, the 50s and the 60s, the feminist movement, the free love, the whole idea that this should be more privatized. Sex was more of a private area, not really the concern of the government. But then we come to this third stage, starting about in the 80s, where maybe there's going to be a mixture of these two between the regulation and the privacy, because although those cases that you read talked a little bit about the private nature of this, or assuming the risk. If you do this kind of activity, you're assuming the risk. Well, that may be the case. It may be private. But when you are harming someone, when you are putting a partner in danger, then tort law should come along and say, hey, we're going to allow for there to be lawsuits to try to deter people.
And my point is just so simple. My point is simply that the law was taking a hands-off approach to misconduct in sexual relationships, giving rise to possible civil liability. At the same time, and probably at least possibly partly as a result of that, sexual disease exploded. I mean, between 1980 and 1990, 8 new sexual diseases were recognized, including AIDS. The disease rate just went ballistic. And I want to just give a few statistics here, just so that people viewing will understand why I think there should be some, well, probably a lot of things need to be done, but there should be some basis for allowing people to sue if someone does give them a disease. The United States has a sexual disease rate of 50 to 1 times the rate of any other industrialized country. 50 to 100 times the rate. That is not a function of how much bigger we are as a country. It's a function of how much more frequently people are infecting each other. Back in 1998, the Institute of Medicine warned that the problem was so out of control that immediate action on all levels of government was absolutely necessary. And this stern warning, including warnings concerning human papillomavirus, just fell on deaf ears. I mean, nothing was done. We never saw ads on television. We never saw, any real government intervention to say, the disease is becoming out of control. And for example, in 1997, this is a long time ago now, like 1997, it was estimated that between 70,000 and 100,000 Americans had been infected with an STD. In 1995, 87% of the 10 most common infectious disease cases were sexual diseases. That's got to be up to over 90% by now. In 1993, researchers warned that unprotected sex is the fastest growing cause of death in the United States. And something a lot of people don't know and are shocked when I tell them, including an African American man at a party 2 weeks ago. I said, what do you think the leading cause of death is for African American men in this country ages 25 to 44? Kind of thought for a minute, didn't really know. And I said, AIDS. AIDS is the leading cause of death for our young American men in America. And it's the second leading cause of death for African American women in the same age group.
Why do you think that is the case, especially in the United States? Why there's government inaction, or at least there has been a lot of government inaction, relatively speaking. Relatively speaking to Europe or other countries, the infection rate is so much higher. Why is that the case? What is it about the United States where that it's much higher?
I've asked a lot of people this question, including Europeans. When I was traveling Europe, I said, why do you think our disease rate is so much higher than yours? And the Europeans have a different answer than the Americans. The Europeans say, well, you guys are all uptight about sex. You guys don't talk about it. It's kind of hidden. We've got this sort of Puritan-based idea about sex that keeps people from having open, honest discussions. Condoms are everywhere in the grocery stores in Europe. You'll see them at the check stand. You'll see them around, and people buy them, throw them on like it's no big deal, because they have an open and probably a healthier way of discussing sex and discussing the problems of sex, pregnancy, and diseases. Americans, I think, have more of a romanticized view of sex. They don't want to talk about it ahead of time. They don't want to think about it ahead of time. They don't want to come prepared, on a date with a condom in their hand. It makes them look, it's kind of creepy almost. That's our mindset here, is you don't want to come off like a sexual being, God forbid. You don't want to let your date know you were thinking about having sex with them before you went on the date, so you don't want to bring a condom. See, and it can go both ways. Imagine a young female bringing a condom and a guy saying, oof, I don't think I want to be with you now, if that's the kind of girl you are. And imagine a guy bringing a condom and the girl saying, well, gosh, what do you think I am? Or why did you think you were going to have sex with me tonight? So it's almost like Americans want to romanticize and have a spontaneous sexual experience, whereas Europeans, it's more of a matter-of-fact part of life.
Yeah. Well, and it could be the history, too, about the moralizing, because always one of the reasons regarding the regulation of sex, at least from the moral or religious point of view, is that sex has consequences. And of course, in the 50s and the sexual revolution, it made it seem like, hey, well, women, everyone should be able to have sex without consequences. Now, to the extent that there were consequences, or have always been consequences, one of them is an unwanted pregnancy, but birth control helped with that issue. And then the other consequence, and the big one we're now dealing with, are the sexually transmitted diseases, although it could be that condoms and testing and responsible disclosure and having a more adult talk about that would be able to deal with the consequences.
And I recently saw an advertisement on TV for a condom in America, which I was like, wow, finally someone's thinking it's a good idea to inform people that they're out there, and people know, but it just put it out there, make it more accessible, make it more a topic of conversation. But I just want to point out the cost of STDs, because this is really, I think, a large part of why I wrote Sex Torts. And the law review article, of course, was written in 2007, and intentional sex torts in 2008, and now I'm working on the book. But people are shocked to learn that in 1998, a long time ago, the estimate was that Americans, all of us, are paying $20 billion a year in just direct medical costs caused by sexual disease. So think about that for a minute, and think about what that means for you. $20 billion a year is a lot of money. Now we're in 2016. I'm guessing it's got to be $30 billion a year now. And I'll read some stats in a minute about how much disease has proliferated recently. But the effect on the health insurance premiums has got to be staggering.
Yeah, and it speaks to the issue that instead of this just being regulated or relegated to a privacy area where people would say, hey, that's none of your business, we can now say with these costs that in a sense it really is literally all of our business.
And this is the point I was just getting to, is that we know from research, and this is what people are shocked by, and this is what people often say to me, well, now I'm convinced there should be sex tort liability. We know from decades of research that a very small percent of Americans are responsible for all sexual disease transmission. They're called core transmitters. These are the people who run around getting diseases because of their behavior and then passing them on to person after person after person. These are usually the ones who get sued, by the way, as well. But you know, these are not a joke. These diseases are very serious, and herpes and HPV are particularly expensive to monitor and treat because they are viral. You can't ever get rid of them. And I have an example. When one of my students saw my article on sex torts, she sent her friend in to talk to me in my office at TSU Law School. And this young lady was 21 years old, and she told me she just had a hysterectomy. And I mean, this poor lady, she wanted kids of her own, and she said, I'll never have kids now. And I said, well, you know, what was it? And she said, well, I got with the wrong guy, and he gave me HPV, and my doctor said it was a bad form. There's lots and lots of forms of HPV, and we're not even sure how many there are. They may mutate. But she was at such risk for developing uterine and other kinds of cancers. She had to have a hysterectomy at age 21. Other times it'll sit dormant for 20, 30 years, and then the person will get cervical cancer or uterine cancer. Or men will get cancers too.
And that's why people are suing, or the regulation through the tort system has come back. Because if you look at what people used to think of were VD, venereal diseases, maybe gonorrhea, syphilis, but those were curable, bacterial, and somehow the tort damage is not as bad as if when it can be cured.
Well, you're not as damaged. You don't have a lifelong disorder. I mean, herpes. Let's just talk about some of the dangers of these STDs. Let's talk about herpes, for example. Herpes was the #1 sexual disease in 1998. It grew dramatically over the course of the years. For example, some people believe it grew 11-fold between the 70s and the 90s. Other estimates are that by the year 2025, 50% of all American women ages 12 to 80 will have genital herpes. In 2015, the Centers for Disease Control estimated 776,000 new cases of herpes among Americans every year. And I mean, this has exploded over the last several years, you know, post the sexual revolution. And free love wasn't so free after all. But ironically, it is now not even the #1 infection. With all these Americans suffering from herpes. And think about that. If you talk about 50% of American women are expected to have it by 2025, and I think American women slightly outnumber the men, so you're talking, well, 160 million women. 80 million. I mean, just on that one disease alone. But ironically, human papillomavirus has grown so quickly that now it is more prevalent than herpes. But back to herpes for just a minute. I watched a trial in October last year, and of a doctor who gave herpes to his girlfriend. And I did not understand how serious this disease was. This woman could not walk. She had a high fever. She couldn't work. Her self-esteem went out the door, which is common for herpes. So it's not a joke. This is not a, you know, people used to make a joke. What's the difference between love and herpes? Remember the answer?
Oh, about it keeps on giving?
Yeah. The one I heard is that herpes is forever, as if love isn't. And people would joke about herpes because it wasn't that common, and people didn't understand how debilitating it is. But it is very devastating for some people. And then ironically for others, they never show symptoms, or they don't really have it.
Well, that's the scary part. I mean, not only are the statistics and the amount of it very alarming, but what's also alarming is for some people, they won't show symptoms, or they'll show very slight symptoms. Maybe they have strong immunities that will be able to at least mask the symptoms. So you might have someone, you talked about the core transmitters, and we'll talk about them a little bit, who might knowingly transmit. But there might be people, or probably many people, who are not even knowing that they are transmitting.
But that's more common for HPV, and it can happen with herpes, but the truth is most people who have herpes have severe reactions within just a few days. The first outbreak usually is within a few days, maybe a week. For most people, it's very hard to say that they didn't know they had herpes.
Well, an important myth is that you cannot transmit if you don't have any open active blister or lesion.
Clinics were saying that 20 years ago. that unless you have an active lesion, you can't transmit herpes. That is just not true. We know now that with no visible signs whatsoever, the skin sheds, and the herpes antigen can be contained in the skin, and you can get herpes from somebody who shows no signs whatsoever of having herpes. And they may think that because they're not having an outbreak, they can't give you herpes, but they can. I mean, and you know, condoms help tremendously, but the problem is you can still get herpes if the lesion or the antigens are contained in the skin in an area that isn't covered by a condom. So herpes is very serious. Now, human papillomavirus is the big problem right now. It's not the basis for lawsuits as often because you can't prove as well who gave what to who. Herpes, you can prove now. They can tell by looking at the blood whether someone has had herpes for a long time or recently got herpes. So the old defense to you gave me herpes was, well, how do I know you didn't give it to me? That's pretty much gone. Of course, you know, science is never exact, but there are experts I've talked to that say that you can generally tell who gave herpes to who, which is why it's the leading basis for a sex tort lawsuit when sexual disease is transmitted, because you can prove who gave what to who. But just about human papillomavirus, I mean, a shocking number of Americans hadn't heard of it just like 10 years ago. And like, what do you know about HPV?
Yeah, well, I've heard of it as a silent killer, that it's the silent killer because it can be transmitted to younger girls that don't even realize what they're getting. The symptoms don't form, and then later in their lives, if they develop a cervical cancer or something like that, they may not even make the connection, or it may take a doctor and a lot of research to even make the connection that that's what it is. But when you look at the statistics and you see what's happening, then you think, hey, I bet much of this is going on and happening, and people don't even realize it.
And let me give you a statistic. In 2000, 20 million cases of HPV existed in the USA. In 2015, it was 79 million. From 20 million to 79 million Americans in the space of 15 years. That is a huge explosion of disease. And of course, on the heels of these courts saying, you know, it's your own fault. You know, it seems to me that if the courts had seen these cases differently, and they do now, they do now. You're not hearing this kind of rhetoric from courts anymore because it's such a serious medical crisis costing us so much money. And people talk about how health insurance premiums have gone up over the past 15 years. Well, this is the #1 type of infectious disease by a long shot. The funny thing about HPV is some forms are just like a common cold. You wouldn't even know you have it. But other forms cause genital warts, and you're almost lucky if you get the kind that causes genital warts because those strains do not cause cancer. Several other of the forms of HPV do cause cancer. They've identified some, and they do have vaccines for some, but it's not just women. It's not just cervical or uterus or cancer of the uterus. It is anogenital cancer, penile cancer. It is everything you can imagine in that region. We now believe is probably linked to human papillomavirus. And other things can happen if left untreated. Any of these diseases, could lead to pelvic inflammatory disease in women, chronic pain. I mean, people don't realize sexual disease is very, very serious. And the Centers for Disease Control report in 2013 that there's 14 million new cases of HPV each year. So it's just spreading so rapidly. It's so expensive. And a condom can help probably in the vast majority of instances to prevent transmission. And yet, you know, we know from studies that the younger people and the ones who have the most sexual partners are the least likely to use condoms. And that's why, for example, we have a teenager in this country getting a sexual disease every 10 seconds. It's brutal, and people under 25 represent like half of new cases of STDs.
Well, one of the issues comes up to say, hey, with all of this alarming news and everything that happens, is it enough to say just use a condom and you're okay? Or there are some people that say, well, it's all about abstinence. But is that really the answer? I mean, does all of this mean, okay, we have to go back really historically almost back to those religious moral times where we'd have to say abstinence is the only way to deal with this? Or do condoms, are condoms the answer?
Well, the answer is probably a mix of both. It's probably a mix of knowing your partner, finding out about them, their background, giving the relationship time. There's nothing like time. A psychologist told me a couple years ago there's a magical number for how long you need to know someone before you marry them to make your chance of divorce go down drastically. You know what that number is? 18 months. You need to know someone 18 months before you consider marrying them. If you don't, your chances of divorce are much higher. So the idea is, get to know the person and use condoms and get tested regularly. Only a third of doctors even recommend testing for STDs. So back again to the sex torts aspect. I'm giving all these stats on the sexual disease to explain how serious the problem is and why every part of our government, including the judiciary and the legal system, should respond to this. Let me give you some statistics from the early 2000s. Based on many years of research, the researchers estimated that 3% of Americans were responsible for 100% of sexual disease transmission. How can this be? Well, it's not randomly spread. Sexual disease is spread disproportionately by persons who have more than 5 partners per year. Turns out that only 3% of Americans, at least in the early 2000s, had more than 5 partners a year. 16% have between 2 and 4 partners per year, and a full 80% have 0 or 1 sexual partner a year. That's probably all the married people and people who are probably over 40. But the thing is that of the 3% of people who have lots and lots of relationships, probably your barflies and your core transmitters, they tend to have overlapping relationships, and that's when disease just is disseminated so quickly, because before they may even know they have a new disease, they give it to someone else. And all the overlapping friends with benefits, these social attitudes of today are part of the reason why we have this incredibly expensive and hurtful sexual disease rate.
We'll talk a little bit about the core transmitters, more who they are. What percentage of core transmitters would you say are men and are women? And then of these core transmitters, what percentage of them know that they are a core transmitter but are still acting irresponsibly anyway? And how many of them don't know? They may be acting negligently if they're not having protected sex, but they may not realize that they are a transmitter. So of those, how would you break that down?
I would have to say, because of just physiology, men give sexual disease to women easier than women give it to men. That's just the reality of how we're built. Of all the cases I've seen, the core transmitters have always been men. And they've been men who've been sued by women for herpes. So I would have to say, based on my knowledge, it would be more often the men who are core transmitters, and that's partly cultural too. I mean, men, get a notch in their belt for every woman they sleep with. So and that's changing. The young people do have more partners than people older like us, but it used to be the case, I think certainly when I was in college, that it was kind of cool or okay for a guy to sleep around, but it was not okay for a woman. And so I think that's part of it. But I mean, in all the cases I've seen, the defendant has almost always been a doctor or a pilot. Now, go figure that. Maybe it's because they have money, and you're not going to sue a 7-Eleven employee probably for herpes transmission, because what are you going to get out of it? But I've noticed that there's these young, good-looking, wealthy, intelligent men with a lot of experience with women. I mean, these are the guys who get a lot of women into bed. And the next show, we're going to talk about a bunch of the real-life cases and the kind of judgments women got when their boyfriend didn't tell them they had herpes and got herpes from them. But I think you can imagine the kind of people, the people who hang out in bars, the people who have alcohol and drug issues. They probably overlap with.
Or I guess now, in a more modern context, the dating websites and Tinder and all of those kind of things.
Yeah, we saw something online about, when we were researching for the show, about someone who had met someone on Tinder and was told she was safe, and she gave him herpes. I think he went after Tinder, didn't he? Was it called Tinder, the website, or?
I don't know. I don't recall which website, but it was like Tinder.
Yeah.
So it was one of the dating websites.
Yeah,
or
there was
hookup sites.
The real problem, I think, is a mix of youth being just having sex crammed down their throats through the media, and at the same time not being told that the sexual disease rate is out of control. And we've got teens dropping like flies with things that were only associated with older people until recent history. The under age 25 group, the young single people who've always had more sexual partners.
Is there a way to get this message out there without it seeming as though you're moralizing, you're judging people, we're blaming the victims, or we're making too many stereotypes about individuals, and just talk about what protected safe sex can mean?
Well, I think the reason why juries are holding in favor of plaintiffs in these cases is because they're recognizing this is serious injury. It's not a matter of morality. It's a matter of health, and not just individual health, public health. So I think the message should be that if you injure someone, whether it's a car accident, you back over someone's tricycle, you have to pay for it. And if you give someone a sexual disease, especially when you knew about it and didn't tell them, that should be actionable. And it's not a morality issue. It's an issue of someone's been hurt. And why should we, all Americans, share in that cost, which we're doing right now? We're all paying for it. And then the upside, too, is that those cases tend to get media attention. So the word gets out, people learn about it, and it could have a norm regulating function. So that's it for Sex Torts 1. We're going to go on to Sex Torts 2 in the next show. You're watching Meet the Professors. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and we'll see you in the next show.